A lesson from the Gospel according to John. When it was evening on that day, the first day of the week, and the doors of the house where the disciples had met were locked for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." But Thomas, who was called the twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands and put my finger in the mark of the nails and my hand in his side, I will not believe." A week later, his disciples were again in the house, and Thomas was with them. Although the doors were shut, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it in my side. Do not doubt, but believe." Thomas answered him, "My Lord and my God." Jesus said to him, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe." Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name.
Well, it's the second Sunday after Easter. By now, the guests have all gone home. The lilies have all been given away. And those who complain that every time they come to church, we either sing, "O Little Town of Bethlehem," or "Christ the Lord is risen today," will not be back until Christmas Eve. Now it's just back to you and me. It's the home folk. You're back in your same seats. You're surrounded by the same special people. You're all here on this Sunday that I like to call where the rubber meets the road. The second Sunday after Easter, where we gather to consider how to respond to the news that Christ is risen among us. And what is the biblical story given to us by the lectionary? What's the story chosen for us to draw inspiration from today to help us in this noble post-Easter striving? It's a serious story. It's a confusing story. We don't know quite what to think of it because it's the story of a group of frightened disciples, skeptics, and doubters, who instead of celebrating the good news of the resurrection, as one would expect them to be doing, are actually locked away in their house in fear, hiding out, afraid of what has happened. And if that isn't disheartening enough, there's also this disciple, Thomas, who, even having heard the testimony of these now newly struggling but believing disciples, doubts their words. And what's even more, he wants some physical evidence that Jesus is truly alive. Now, don't you think that's a strange biblical follow-up to the grand Easter story? I mean, if I were directing the Easter message on the second Sunday after Easter, I'd have some grand miracle occur. I'd have some wonderful healing take place, or maybe a grand parade with Jesus leading the way on a white horse, marching into Jerusalem to take names. But that's not what we get. What we get is fear, doubt, skepticism, and more than a little confusion. Yes, it's a very serious Sunday. And yet, I've been preaching long enough to know that if millions of Christians around the world are being asked to consider a specific biblical text for the day, that there must be some hidden gem, some pearl, some small truth buried within this confusing story that's been deemed important enough by centuries of Christians to have us consider this day. So what might that pearl of wisdom be? Well, what we know is that this story of Thomas is found only in the Gospel of John, And the writer of John's gospel is writing this memoir almost 70 years after Jesus' death. He's writing it at a time when the Jewish and Gentile Christians were experiencing tremendous persecution. And during this time, Jewish Christians were leaving the synagogue in droves, either voluntarily or under enormous pressure from family and friends because of the tension between the Jews who believed that Jesus was not the Messiah and the Jewish Christians who believed that he was. And to leave the auspices of Judaism, you see, was an early dangerous act for these Christians. Dangerous because Judaism was protected by the Romans, but Christianity was not. Meaning that most Christians who were forced out of these synagogues because of their belief in Jesus were tempted to go into hiding for fear of the Roman authorities. So do you see it? It's very clear. In light of this context, it's clear that the author of John's gospel would have felt it particularly meaningful to include in his book the story of yet another group of disciples, some 70 years earlier, who were in hiding too, hiding out because of their belief, who were seeking refuge behind locked doors, fearful of the Roman authorities. But it still doesn't answer the question of, so why did the writer also think it important to introduce us to Thomas? I mean, why did the writer think it important for Thomas not to be here, initially hidden behind the locked doors? I'm glad you asked. I think I know. You see, in the Gospel of John, Thomas makes 3 appearances. And each time Thomas is portrayed as this man of great courage. First we see him in the raising of Lazarus, and he's shown as this brave disciple. Next we see Thomas in the upper room, and he's shown as this inquisitive disciple. And then, of course, we have today. And as the rest of these disciples are locked behind these closed doors, we hear of Thomas again, but this time he's conspicuously absent, leading us to assume that the brave, inquisitive disciple Thomas was also, shall we say, restless, adventuresome. And to conclude, perhaps he's out in the city. He's maybe gathering information to bring back to others. So he misses Jesus' first appearance to these disciples in the locked room. And yet, true to form, when Thomas does show up, and he is informed of the event, inquisitive but rather concrete thinking, Thomas replies, "Unless I see, I will not believe." And clearly, at least for the writer of John, this is an important statement for Thomas to make. And yet, down through the centuries, those who would have us Christians live in pious perfection have imposed upon Thomas the unflattering reputation of Thomas being a doubter. Anyone learned that in Sunday school? Doubting Thomas, he's called, correct? My mama used to say, "Baggott, don't you be like Thomas." He doubted. Do you know what? I don't buy it. Instead, I'm wondering if maybe, just perhaps, it could be that the writer of John's gospel lifts up this line about Thomas in order to ask us to see Thomas, shall we say, for the courageous man that he truly was. Because let's face it, I mean, Thomas was no more of a doubter than any of the other disciples, was he? I mean, none of the other disciples believed Jesus' resurrection merely on verbal assurances. In fact, they called Mary Magdalene's story an idle tale. No, Thomas is no different from the others. Thomas just wants to see things for himself. And here's the interesting thing. Did you know that although we name him Thomas, that the word Thomas was actually not a name in Jesus' day? Did you know that? I'm not making this up, folks. Thomas was not a name. It was a label. Wow. And you know what it means? Thomas literally means in the Aramaic, the twin. But here's what's interesting. We don't know for whom Thomas was a twin. Some say he looked a lot like Jesus. Do you know what many other scholars believe to be the more likely explanation of why Thomas the twin is in this story in the first place? Listen to this. John's author is probably trying to tell those first century persecuted Christians in 100 AD who were hidden away behind their locked doors in rooms of dark discouragement and doubt. The writer's probably trying to tell them that Thomas can be their twin in their faith. And that to be a twin of Thomas is not an unflattering characterization, but rather it's something to be desired. Because Thomas did not hide himself away in fear because of his doubt about the power and presence of Christ in their midst as others did. Rather, while they were hiding, Thomas was out there seeking and searching and yearning until he encountered the risen Christ and what he needed to believe. You ever wanted to do that? I mean, have you ever doubted? You ever struggled with the dogma and orthodoxy and Christianity? Tell the truth now, you're in church. We all have. And John wants the early followers of Jesus to know, just as I think John wants us to know as well, that doubting does not have to distance us from God, for as the story shows, doubt is not an enemy of faith. Rather, doubt is the impetus to a greater faith. In fact, have you ever noticed how often this truth has been observed? Was it Tennyson? There exists more faith in honest doubt than in half the creeds. Dostoevsky, doubt is neither an angel or a devil, for my hosannas have always been forged in the crucibles of doubt. C.S. Lewis, doubt is not the lack of faith, rather the lack of doubt is the absence of depth. Clark Ambleside, the opposite of faith is not doubt, rather the opposite of faith is blind certainty. Ugh. And my favorite one from Frederick Buechner, if you don't have any doubts, you're either kidding yourself or you're asleep. Because doubts are the ants in the pants of faith. They keep you awake and moving. Yeah, it seems to me John's author is suggesting that struggling with our faith, questioning our faith, looking more deeply into our faith without fear, it's not a bad thing. It's simply what gets you moving. It's simply what gets you on to your final goal. Struggles and doubts, folks, they are good for us in that they help us grow towards a deeper and more authentic faith, like Thomas, who was unwilling to cave to that which he did not understand until that which he did not understand became real to him. Belief took over, and then Thomas uttered this astonishing statement, considered by most to be the paramount statement about Jesus' identity in all the Gospels. Thomas says ultimately, "My Lord and my God." And did you hear how Jesus responded? Jesus says, "Have you believed because you've seen me, Thomas? Well, blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe." And there it is. That's the nugget. That's the pearl of wisdom. That is why every Christian in the universal church has been asked to consider this text, to peer more deeply into its message. It's this line that really is saying, happy are we, fortunate are we, fulfilled are we, when our doubts keep us working and seeking until we can claim Christ's momentous presence and identity in our lives with as much conviction of belief as Thomas did. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe. Let me tell you a story. I read about it in a journal a few years ago. There was this relatively successful young executive at an international banking firm in Manhattan. And in the journal, he talked about how he gave up on religion at the age of 20. 20. You're just learning to live, and you're giving up. He had too many doubts. He had too many questions. His parents didn't go to church much anymore, so he just kind of followed them out of the church. But then he went on to describe the emptiness that began to settle in over him during his late 20s and his adult years. In spite of the fact that he'd fulfilled the script that we all expect of those young ones, do we not? He was well known. He was successful. And this emptiness he felt led him back to a sanctuary one Sunday morning on Easter, where he found himself, surprisingly, praying for direction. The service was over, and as he was walking out, he noticed a bulletin board, and on it was a note. And the note said this: volunteers urgently needed at St. Luke's Roosevelt Hospital, meeting tomorrow night in the church parlor at 6 o'clock. Now, this young man knew the grand bars of New York. He knew the great restaurants of Manhattan, but he'd never been in a church parlor before. You know what a church parlor looks like? I'll leave that in your imagination. He showed up the next night at the meeting in the parlor, and there they were. There was a lawyer, there was a housewife, there was an opera singer, there was a member of the United Nations Children's Fund, an advertising executive, a grandmother, and a theology undergraduate. And you know what he said? He said he found new life volunteering at that hospital. He found new life. While there one night, the director of volunteers led him to the pediatric ward, and where 6 border babies were sleeping. These little ones, she explained, had been abandoned or had come from drug-addicted mothers or both, and they often waited months and months for adoption or foster care. These were real orphans. They were boarding there at the hospital. And what they needed most was to be held and loved. Could he help? What first thought of doing this, the young man said he was terrified. But thereafter, around 10 p.m., when his friends were usually just ramping up, 3 nights a week, you could find this bank executive in that pediatric ward cradling one of these little babies in his arms, rocking them back and forth slowly, giving to this child what all children need, a sense of care and concern and love. Here's the best part. Later, when he's interviewed about this, here's what the young man said. I would say that doubt took me out of the church, but emptiness brought me back to the church, and now the church has sent me out on a mission whose impact I know I will never know. My doubts have not subsided, but the difference now is that I have placed my doubts in the right perspective, never again allowing them to take from me the joy of claiming what I do believe. Did you hear that? Never again allowing my doubts to take from me the joy of what I do believe. And you see this young executive, he found exactly what Thomas found. That you don't have to have everything settled in your faith to embrace the power of the resurrected Christ with faith. Let me say that again. You don't have to have everything settled in your faith to embrace the power of the resurrected Christ with faith. You just have to be willing to put yourself in the presence of this resurrected Christ's power, and then God will do the rest. Which is why on this Rubber Meets the Road Sunday, when we attempt to make the resurrection real for us, that we share in Holy Communion. Because for millions of Christians, for thousands of years, Christ has been present in the wine of mourning and in the cup of gladness. On battlefields, in castles, on mountains, in valleys, in hospitals, in hospice, and all along the way, Christ has been there. We don't have to believe everything, but if we can simply accept that, what happens? Then blessed are we who have not seen and yet believe. Blessed are we who have come to witness the resurrected Christ among us. In the name of God the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.